Before the pyramids, before the first stones of recorded history were set, there existed a language carved into clay by hands that shaped the first cities. The Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia wrote not on paper or parchment, but on tablets that would survive floods, wars, and the collapse of empires. When archaeologists first unearthed these fragments in the 19th century, they found something unexpected, not simple records of grain and trade, but stories of creation, of beings descending from the heavens, and of humanity's purpose, as something other than what we have been taught. Among these tablets are texts that describe gods who walked among men, who mixed their essence with the clay of earth, and who left before their work was complete. Some scholars call these myths poetic attempts by early people to explain their world. Others see something different, a record deliberately preserved, a message carved into the oldest writing known to man, waiting to be read not as legend, but as memory. Tonight, we examine those tablets, the words they contain, and the question they pose: what if the story of where we came from was never lost, only mistranslated? This is What If Humanity's Origin was written in Sumerian tablets. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard stood in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, brushing dust from a fragment of baked clay. The surface was covered in wedge-shaped marks, tiny impressions pressed into the tablet before it was fired. These were not decorative. They were intentional, systematic, and numerous. Layard had found the first large collection of cuneiform tablets, the oldest known form of writing in human history. Over the next decades, more than 30,000 tablets would be recovered from the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a land the Greeks called Mesopotamia, the place between the rivers. Among those fragments were the voices of a civilization older than Egypt, older than the great dynasties of China, a people who called themselves the Sumerians. The Sumerian language had no known relatives. It did not descend from any other tongue recorded by historians. It simply appeared, fully formed, around 3,400 BCE, already sophisticated enough to record complex legal codes, astronomical observations, and epic poetry. When scholars first attempted to translate cuneiform in the 1850 seconds, they faced a script with over 600 distinct symbols, many of which changed meaning depending on context. The work required decades of cross-referencing with later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, which had borrowed Sumerian words and occasionally provided bilingual inscriptions. By 1900, the basic grammar was understood. By 1930, entire libraries had been translated. What they revealed was not what anyone expected. The tablets did not only record taxes, treaties, and temple inventories. They told stories, long, detailed narratives about the creation of the world, the separation of heaven and earth, and the making of humankind. In one text, known as the Eridu Genesis, the gods deliberate over the need for workers to tend the earth. In another, called the Atrahasis, humanity is formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. The precision was unsettling. These were not vague allegories. The texts named specific gods, described their relationships, and outlined the sequence of events with the clarity of a report. The tone was not reverential or mystical, it was procedural, as if recounting something that had happened and needed to be remembered. One of the earliest tablets to be translated in full was part of the Sumerian king list, discovered in 1906 by Hermann Hilprecht at the ancient city of Nippur. The tablet listed the rulers of Sumer in chronological order, beginning with the phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven." The kingship was in Eredug. The list continued with the names of kings and the lengths of their reigns, but the numbers were extraordinary. The first king, Alulim, was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalyar, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total were listed before the flood, each reigning for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns became shorter, still measured in centuries, but no longer in millennia. The transition was abrupt, as if something fundamental had changed. Mainstream scholars interpreted this as mythological exaggeration, a way for ancient scribes to express the distant, almost divine authority of early rulers. But the detail was strange. The numbers were not random. They followed patterns multiples of 60, the base of the Sumerian numerical system. If these were myths, they were highly organized myths, recorded with the precision of a calendar. Some researchers noted that the king list was copied and recopied across different cities and centuries, always with the same figures. If it was fiction treated as fact for over 1,000 years. By the early 20th century, more tablets emerged that deepened the mystery. In 1914, during excavations at the ancient city of Kish, a text was found describing the Anunnaki beings who came down from the heavens, and who were described not as metaphors, but as physical entities with roles, hierarchies, and conflicts. The word Anunnaki itself means those who from heaven to earth came. Some tablets name them individually: Anu, the Sky Father; Enlil, Lord of the Air; Enki, God of Water and Wisdom. They were not distant, unknowable forces. They argued, divided labor, and made decisions in councils. One text described how Enlil grew tired of the noise of humanity and sent a flood to silence them. Another told how Enki, in defiance, warned a man named Ziusudra to build a boat and save his family. The similarity to the biblical story of Noah was undeniable, but the Sumerian version predated the Hebrew Bible by at least 1,000 years. In fact, many biblical scholars now accept that the Genesis flood narrative was likely adapted from earlier Mesopotamian sources. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a later Babylonian text also derived from Sumerian stories, contains a nearly identical account. This suggested that the flood was not a unique Hebrew tradition, but a memory preserved across cultures, originating in Sumer, and carried forward by every civilization that followed. What troubled some researchers was not the myth itself, but its preservation. Why would a story be retold with such consistency across millennia, unless it was considered essential? The Sumerians did not write casually. Clay tablets were labor-intensive to produce. Each one had to be shaped, inscribed while wet, and fired in a kiln. Writing was reserved for things that mattered: laws, temple records, astronomical charts, and these stories. If the creation of humanity and the actions of the Anunnaki were merely metaphorical, why were they given the same documentary care as contracts and king lists? In 1902, the German archaeologist Friedrich Delitzsch gave a controversial lecture in Berlin titled Babel und Bibel, arguing that much of the Old Testament was borrowed from Babylonian and Sumerian sources. He presented side-by-side comparisons of Genesis and the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which itself drew from older Sumerian texts. The parallels were precise: the separation of waters, the creation of light, the fashioning of man from earth. Religious authorities were outraged, but scholars could not deny the evidence. The question became, if the Bible borrowed its creation story from Sumer, and if Sumer claimed their gods were literal beings, then what were the Hebrews actually translating? The language barrier itself added another layer of uncertainty. Sumerian cuneiform could be read phonetically, but many signs had multiple meanings. The word for God, dingir, could also mean sky or bright. The term for heaven, An, was also the name of the chief deity. Context determined meaning, but context required assumptions. When a tablet described the Anunnaki descending from An, did it mean descending from the god Anu, or descending from the sky? The grammar allowed both. Translators had to choose which interpretation fit the narrative they believed was being told. By the 1950 seconds, thousands of cuneiform tablets had been catalogued, but only a fraction had been fully translated. Many remained in museum storage, their contents unknown. Among these were administrative texts, medical records, and what appeared to be technical manuals, instructions for metallurgy, agriculture, and irrigation systems far more advanced than expected from a Bronze Age society. One tablet described a method for purifying water using crushed charcoal and sand, a process not rediscovered in Europe until the 18th century. Another outlined the principles of crop rotation to prevent soil depletion. The Sumerians knew things they should not have known, or at least, things they should not have known so early. The language remained a mystery in one final way: its origin. Every other known language evolved gradually, leaving traces of simpler forms in older dialects. Sumerian appeared complete, with no clear ancestor. Linguists have classified it as a language isolate, meaning it shares no known genetic relationship with any other language family on Earth. It simply emerged, was used for over 2,000 years, and then vanished, absorbed into Akkadian and Babylonian. The people who spoke it wrote of gods who gave them writing, laws, and the knowledge to build cities. Whether this was a metaphor for cultural development or a record of something else, the tablets themselves do not say. They only preserve the claim, carved into clay, that the knowledge came from elsewhere. The oldest known piece of writing in human history is not a poem or a prayer. It is an accounting ledger. Found in the ancient city of Uruk, dated to around 3400 BCE, the tablet records quantities of barley, livestock, and labor hours. But even this mundane text holds significance. It proves that writing was not invented for art or religion. It was invented for control, for keeping track of resources in a society that had grown too complex to remember everything. The Sumerians did not write to tell stories. They wrote because they had to. Yet within a few hundred years, the same script used to count grain was being used to record the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation narratives ever discovered. The shift from bookkeeping to cosmology happened quickly, as if the technology of writing had unlocked something larger, an ability not just to record the present, but to preserve the past and project the future. The Sumerians became archivists of their own existence, and in doing so, they wrote down what they believed to be the origins of the world. The Eridu Genesis, pieced together from fragments found in Nippur and other sites, describes a time before cities, when the earth was barren and uninhabited. The god Enki is credited with creating order, separating land from water, establishing the first settlements, and organizing the labor of lesser beings. The text then introduces the creation of humanity, described as a deliberate act to relieve the gods of physical toil. One passage reads, "Let man carry the load of the gods." This is not symbolic language. It is transactional. Humanity, according to the text, was designed with a function. In the Atrahasis, another Sumerian origin text preserved in later Akkadian versions, the details become even more explicit. The tablet describes how the Anunnaki gods were themselves laboring, digging rivers, clearing irrigation channels, building the infrastructure of the early world. After 40 years of this work, they rebelled. They laid down their tools, surrounded the house of Enlil, and demanded relief. A council was convened. The solution proposed by Enki was to create a new worker, a primitive worker. The text calls it who would take on the burden. The method described is unsettling in its specificity. The god Vela, described as having intelligence, is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay, and from this mixture, humans are formed. The text states, "From his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be joined in the clay." This imagery, blood mixed with earth, appears repeatedly across Sumerian literature. It is not presented as allegory, it is presented as process. The tablets describe ratios, ingredients, divine oversight. They name the goddess responsible, Nintu, also called Ninhursag, the mother of all living. Her title predates the biblical Eve, yet her role is nearly identical. She is the one who shapes the form, who breathes function into the clay, who presides over the creation of biological life. Modern readers often interpret these passages as primitive attempts to explain natural reproduction or the mystery of consciousness. But the Sumerians had words for natural birth. They used different terms when describing human reproduction versus this initial act of creation. The distinction was deliberate. What they described in the creation tablets was not the birth of children, but the formation of a species, an event separate from the ordinary process of life. In 1912, a French excavation at the ancient city of Susa unearthed a cylinder seal, a small carved stone used to roll impressions into wet clay. The seal depicted a scene, a seated figure, larger than the others, surrounded by standing humans who appeared to be presenting offerings. Above the seated figure were symbols associated with the Anunnaki. The inscription, translated later, read, "Enki, creator of man, receives the labor of his creation." The image was not worshipful in the traditional sense. It was documentary. It showed hierarchy, function, relationship. The humans were smaller, but they were not groveling. They were working. By the mid-20th century, the sheer volume of cuneiform tablets had made one thing clear. The Sumerians did not write in metaphors the way later cultures did. When they described building a temple, they gave measurements. When they described a flood, they listed the duration. When they described the creation of humanity, they named the participants, described the materials, and outlined the reason. If these were myths, they were myths told with the tone of engineering manuals. The question began to shift. It was no longer whether the Sumerians believed these stories, but why they wrote them the way they did. Why describe gods as beings with tasks, frustrations, and counsels? Why depict creation as a mixture of divine material and earthly substance? Why preserve these details across generations with such consistency that even cities separated by hundreds of miles kept identical versions of the same texts? One of the most detailed accounts comes from a series of tablets called the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which borrowed heavily from earlier Sumerian sources. The text describes how the universe began in chaos, how the gods emerged from primordial waters, and how they eventually divided roles and responsibilities. Marduk, the chief Babylonian god, defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and uses her body to create the heavens and the earth. But the text does not stop there. It goes on to describe the creation of humanity using the blood of Tiamat's slain consort, Kingu, mixed with earth. The purpose is stated plainly: let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe. These are not the words of people worshipping distant, incomprehensible forces. These are the words of people describing employers, taskmasters, and engineers. The relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki, as depicted in the tablets, is not one of awe, but of labor arrangement. Humans serve, and in return, the gods provide order, irrigation, laws, and the structure of civilization. What complicates this further is the technological language embedded in some texts. One tablet describes how the goddess Ninhursag purified the clay before mixing it, using a term that later Sumerian texts associate with refining metals or filtering liquids. Another describes how the first humans were placed in rows and observed for defects. The vocabulary is agricultural, but the process described is more like quality control. In a few rare fragments, the word gulupu is used, a term that scholars translate as tree or reed, but which in context seems to describe something structural, possibly a mold or form into which the clay-human mixture was placed. None of this proves the tablets are literal, but it does raise the question of why a Bronze Age people would use such precise procedural language if they were only telling a symbolic story. Modern myths do not describe the gods measuring ingredients or checking outcomes. They describe miracles, divine will, and instant transformation. The Sumerian texts, by contrast, describe steps sulid d, repeatable, recorded as if someone might need to reference them later. By the time cuneiform had been fully deciphered in the early 1900s, scholars had a problem. The Sumerians had written the world's first literature, the first laws, the first astronomical charts, and the first detailed account of humanity's creation by beings they called gods, who came from the sky, who labored on earth, and who made humans to continue that labor. Whether this was history or mythology, no one could say. But it was written first, and everything that came after, including the Bible, borrowed from it. Among the most enigmatic documents recovered from ancient Sumer is a single clay tablet known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, housed today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It was discovered in 1923 by archaeologist Stephen Langdon during an excavation at the site of ancient Larsa. The prism is a four-sided column of baked clay, inscribed with the names of Sumerian kings in vertical columns. At the top, in careful cuneiform script, it states, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug." What follows is a chronological list of rulers, divided into two distinct eras, those who reigned before the flood and those who reigned after it. The division is not casual, it is explicit. The text marks a boundary in history, separating a time that was different from everything that came later. Before the flood, 8 kings are named, ruling from 5 cities: Eridu, Badtibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. The combined length of their reigns totals 241,200 years. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alalhar, ruled for 36,000 years. The pattern continues, each reign measured not in decades or even centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. Then comes the line: the flood swept over. After this event, the reigns shortened dramatically. Post-flood kings ruled for 1,200 years, then 600, then eventually down to lifespans that approach what we might consider human: 126 years, 90 years, 30 years. The transition is stark, as if something fundamental about existence itself had changed. Mainstream archaeology interprets the king list as a blend of myth and history, suggesting that the pre-flood rulers represent legendary or symbolic figures, while the post-flood names correspond to actual historical kings who can be cross-referenced with other records. This is a reasonable conclusion. Archaeological evidence confirms that several of the later kings, such as Gilgamesh of Uruk, were real people who ruled real cities around 2600 BCE. Their reigns, temples, and inscriptions have been found, but the pre-flood section remains unverifiable. No physical evidence ties Al-Ulam or Al-Aljar to archaeological sites. They exist only in the text. Yet the Sumerian king list was not treated as fiction by those who wrote it. It was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, appearing in multiple versions across different cities. Each copy lists the same names, the same reign lengths, the same cities. The consistency is deliberate. If this were mythology, one might expect variation, embellishment, or regional differences. Instead, the king list reads like an official record, something preserved, because it was believed to be accurate. What complicates the interpretation further is that the list does not treat the pre-flood kings as gods. They are called kings, not deities. They are mortal rulers, placed in cities, given reign lengths, and listed in sequence, just like their post-flood successors. The text does not say they were immortal or divine. It simply states how long they ruled. The implication is that these were human or human-like figures who lived under conditions so different that their lifespans were measured on a scale modern biology cannot explain. This has led to 2 broad schools of thought. The first, held by most academic scholars, is that the numbers are symbolic. Perhaps they represent generations or dynasties or cycles of kingship rather than individual reigns. The second, more controversial view, is that the numbers reflect an actual memory of a different epoch, a time when human biology, environmental conditions, or some other factor allowed for lifespans far beyond what is considered possible today. Proponents of this view point to similar traditions in other cultures. The biblical patriarchs, who lived for hundreds of years before the flood, and much shorter lives afterward. The Hindu Vedas, which describe yugas, or ages, when lifespans were vastly extended. And the Egyptian king lists, which also record impossibly long reigns in the earliest periods. The Hebrew Bible in particular mirrors the structure of the king list almost exactly. Genesis 5 lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, each with lifespans ranging from 365 years, Enoch, to 969 years, Methuselah. After the flood, in Genesis 11, the lifespans drop sharply. Shem lives 600 years, but by the time of Abraham, lifespans are down to 175 years, and by Moses to 120. The pattern is identical to the Sumerian king list: long pre-flood lives, a catastrophic flood, and a sudden shortening of the human lifespan afterward. The parallels were noted as early as 1872, when George Smith of the British Museum deciphered a Babylonian tablet describing the flood. The story was nearly identical to the account in Genesis, but predated it by at least a millennium. Smith's discovery sent shockwaves through Victorian England. If the Bible's flood story was borrowed from Mesopotamia, what else had been borrowed? And if the Sumerians listed kings before the flood, who ruled for tens of thousands of years, what were the Hebrews describing when they wrote of patriarchs who lived for centuries? Some researchers have suggested that the numbers in both traditions were corrupted over time, or that ancient scribes used different counting systems that modern scholars misinterpret. Others have proposed that the years might refer to lunar months rather than solar years, which would reduce the figures to more plausible ranges. But these explanations create as many problems as they solve. If the numbers were symbolic or corrupted, why did the Sumerians, Babylonians, Hebrews, and Egyptians all independently use the same narrative structure? Long pre-flood lives, a flood, and then shortened lifespans? The flood itself is described in multiple Sumerian texts with remarkable consistency. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis, and the later Epic of Gilgamesh all tell the same story. The gods, led by Enlil, decide to destroy humanity with a great deluge. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, defies this decision and warns a human named Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, or Utnapishtim in Babylonian, to build a boat and save his family along with representatives of all living creatures. The boat is described in detail. Its dimensions, materials, and construction are listed with precision. After the flood, the survivor offers sacrifices, and the gods, smelling the offerings, realize they need humanity to continue. A new covenant is made, and kingship is restored, but under different terms. The question of whether this flood was a historical event has occupied researchers for over a century. Geologists have found evidence of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, corresponding roughly to the period between the legendary pre-flood kings and the historically verified post-flood rulers. Sediment layers indicate that several Sumerian cities were submerged simultaneously, with evidence of sudden deep water deposition. This was not a river overflow. It was a massive inundation that covered the entire southern plain. But a regional flood, however catastrophic, would not explain the global distribution of flood myths. Over 200 cultures around the world have stories of a great deluge that destroyed an earlier age of humanity. The details vary, but the structure is the same: a warning, a survivor, a boat, a new beginning. Some scholars argue this reflects a universal human experience with local flooding, magnified over generations into myth. Others suggest it points to an actual worldwide event, perhaps the rapid melting of glaciers at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, which raised sea levels by over 120 meters and submerged vast coastal regions where early human populations may have lived. The Sumerian king list does not explain what caused the flood, only that it happened, and that afterward, everything changed. The kings who came after ruled for lifespans that steadily declined, eventually reaching what we might recognize as natural human limits. The text treats this shift as a fact, not a mystery. It does not ask why. It simply records the transition, as if documenting a known decline from an earlier, different state of existence. One of the most intriguing aspects of the king list is its final line, which appears in some versions. These are the kings after the flood. The phrasing implies continuity. The flood did not end civilization, it interrupted it. Kingship resumed. Cities were rebuilt. The same institutions, the same gods, the same hierarchies returned. But the people were different. They aged faster. They ruled for less time. Whatever had sustained the earlier kings, whether it was environment, biology, or something else, was gone. Modern biology offers no framework for understanding lifespans of 28,000 years, or even 900 years. The human body, as we know it, is subject to cellular degradation, DNA damage, and metabolic limits that cap lifespan well below 200 years, even in ideal conditions. Yet the king list insists these figures were real. It names them, places them in cities, gives them reigns, and integrates them seamlessly into a chronology that later becomes historically verifiable. Whether the pre-flood kings were human, something else, or symbolic representations of a lost epoch, the Sumerian king list stands as one of history's most persistent enigmas. It was written in the world's oldest script, preserved for millennia, and treated by ancient scribes as a document of record. It divides time into two ages, separated by a flood, with a clear before and after, and it suggests, in its cold, bureaucratic way, that there was once a time when the rules of life were different, a time when kings ruled not for decades, but for eons, before the waters rose and swept it all away. The Anunnaki appear across Sumerian texts not as abstract forces or distant creators, but as individuals with names, roles, and relationships. They are described as beings who came down from heaven and who organized the early world into a functioning system. The word Anunnaki itself has been debated. Most scholars agree it translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, though the exact grammar is ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is their function. They are portrayed as administrators, engineers, and rulers beings, with specific jobs who delegated tasks and managed resources. The earliest mentions of the Anunnaki appear in texts from the 3rd millennium BCE, during the early dynastic period of Sumer. They are not yet gods in the later religious sense. They are called Dingir, a Sumerian word often translated as God, but which can also mean shining one, or those of the bright sky. The term is visual, not theological. It describes appearance or origin, not divinity. In these early texts, the Anunnaki are divided into ranks. At the top is Anu, described as the father of the sky. Below him are his sons, Enlil, the lord of the air and storms, and Enki, the lord of waters and wisdom. These three form a triad of authority, and beneath them are dozens of lesser Anunnaki, each assigned to specific tasks: agriculture, metallurgy, building, law, and the oversight of human labor. One of the most detailed descriptions comes from a tablet known as the Descent of Inanna, discovered in Nippur, and dated to around 2400 BCE. The text describes how Inanna, the goddess of love and war, descends into the underworld ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. At each of 7 gates, she must remove a piece of her divine regalia, her crown, her robe, her jewelry, until she arrives naked and powerless. The story is often read as a symbolic death and rebirth, but the language is strikingly literal. The gates are physical structures. The journey takes time. Inanna's power is not intrinsic, it is worn, removable, tied to objects. When she returns to the surface, she must reclaim these items to restore her authority. This depiction of gods as beings whose power comes from tools or garments is unusual. Most ancient mythologies describe divinity as an inherent quality. But in Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki carry symbols of office, the Mi, a Sumerian concept often translated as divine decrees or cosmic principles. These Mi are described as objects that can be stolen, traded, or lost. Inanna herself is said to have tricked Enki into giving her several Mi while he was drunk, which she then brought to her city of Uruk to enhance its power. The Mi include knowledge of kingship, writing, metalworking, music, and the art of warfare. They are not abstract, they are transferable, functional, almost technological. The word Mi has no clear equivalent in modern languages. Some scholars translate it as divine power, others as cultural institution. But in the texts, the Mi behave more like devices or blueprints. Whoever possesses them can wield the associated ability. This has led to speculation that the Sumerians were describing advanced knowledge or technology given to humanity by the Anunnaki, encoded in the language of mythology, because no other vocabulary existed. In the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki are described as originally performing physical labor themselves. For 40 years, the text states, they dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, clearing channels for irrigation and drainage. The work was exhausting. The text describes them complaining, throwing down their tools, and surrounding the house of Enlil in protest. A council is called. Enki proposes a solution: create a new worker to bear the burden. The decision is unanimous. Humanity is made not as an act of love or inspiration, but as a labor-saving measure. This portrayal of gods as workers who grow tired, who rebel, who need relief, is almost unique in world mythology. Other creation myths describe gods who speak worlds into existence, who create from will alone. The Sumerian version is procedural. It describes effort, exhaustion, negotiation, and delegation. The Anunnaki are managers, not magicians. One of the most frequently cited tablets is a fragment known as the Debate Between Cattle and Grain, which describes how the Anunnaki created these resources for humanity's benefit. The text states, "In those days, in the creation chamber of the gods, cattle and grain were fashioned." The phrase creation chamber is unusual. It implies a location, a workspace. The gods did not create spontaneously, they worked in a specific place, using specific methods. The text does not elaborate on what those methods were, but the language is consistent with other Sumerian descriptions of divine activity: deliberate, localized, procedural. The relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity is depicted as hierarchical, but not distant. In many texts, humans serve the gods directly, building temples, providing food offerings, maintaining irrigation systems. But the gods also instruct humans. They give laws, teach agriculture, establish kingship. The relationship is reciprocal, even if unequal. Humans depend on the gods for order and knowledge. The gods depend on humans for labor and sustenance. This mutualism is central to Sumerian religion and society. Temples were not just places of worship. They were economic centers, storehouses, administrative hubs. The god was the landowner. The priests were the managers. The people were the workers. The entire system reflected the cosmic model described in the creation tablets. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, around 2300 BCE, the Anunnaki had become more formalized into a pantheon. Texts from this period list 50 primary Anunnaki, divided between those of the sky and those of the underworld. The roles were specific. Shamash was the god of justice and the sun. Nana governed the moon. Ishtar, the Akkadian name for Inanna, ruled love and war. Each had a city, a temple, a jurisdiction. They were not omnipresent, they resided in places. They could be absent or present. They traveled. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods convene in councils to decide the fate of humanity, and at one point, they are described as going away to a distant place, leaving humanity to fend for itself. This idea that the gods could leave is repeated across several texts. In one fragment, Enki is described as departing to the Abzu, a term that refers both to the underground waters and to a specific location, possibly his temple in the city of Eridu. In another, Enlil withdraws to the mountain, which may refer to a physical retreat or a symbolic departure. These are not the actions of omnipresent, omnipotent deities. These are the actions of beings who occupy space, who have locations, who can be here or elsewhere. One of the most controversial aspects of the Anunnaki mythology is the claim, made by some modern interpreters, that they were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial beings. This interpretation is largely based on the work of Zecharia Sitchin, a researcher who published a series of books beginning in the 1976, starting with The 12th Planet. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were visitors from a planet called Nibiru, which he claimed had a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around the Sun. According to his interpretation, the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, created humans as workers through genetic engineering, and eventually left, leaving behind only stories and ruins. Sitchin's theories have been widely rejected by mainstream scholars. His translations of Sumerian cuneiform have been criticized as inaccurate, and his astronomical claims about Nibiru are not supported by modern planetary science. No evidence of a hidden planet with such an orbit exists, and the mechanics of such a system would violate known laws of celestial dynamics. Yet Sitchin's work has been hugely influential in popular culture, spawning entire subcultures devoted to ancient astronaut theories and alternative archaeology. What makes Sitchin's work compelling to some, despite its flaws, is that he took the Sumerian texts literally. Where scholars saw metaphor, he saw description. Where they saw gods, he saw visitors. He treated the Anunnaki not as mythological inventions, but as historical actors. His mistake, according to critics, was not in reading the text closely, but in misreading the language itself. Sumerian is complex, context-dependent, and often poetic even in its most factual passages. A literal translation does not necessarily reveal literal truth. Still, the question remains, why did the Sumerians describe their gods the way they did? Why are they physical, localized, hierarchical, and procedural? Why do they eat, travel, argue, and need rest? Why are their powers tied to objects that can be stolen or lost? These are not the characteristics of the transcendent deities found in later religions. They are the characteristics of something else, something that, whether divine or not, the Sumerians understood as real, present, and essential to the structure of their world. The tablets do not answer these questions. They only preserve the descriptions, written in the oldest language, in the oldest cities, by people who had no reason to lie and no framework for fantasy. They wrote what they believed to be true. Whether that belief was based on memory, experience, or imagination, the text does not say. It only says, "These are the gods who came down, who created us, who gave us laws, and who may one day return." Among the most complete accounts of human creation in Sumerian literature is the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian text dating to around 1200 BCE, but based on earlier Sumerian sources. The name translates as "when on high," the opening words of the epic. The tablet describes the creation of the universe in stages, beginning with primordial chaos, progressing through the emergence of the gods, and culminating in the formation of humanity. Unlike later religious texts, the Enuma Elish does not treat creation as a miracle. It treats it as a process, one that involves conflict, labor, and deliberate engineering. The narrative begins with two primordial entities, Apsu, representing fresh water, and Tiamat, representing salt water. Their union produces the first generation of gods, who are noisy and disruptive. Apsu, disturbed by the chaos, decides to destroy them. Enki learns of the plan and kills Apsu. Tiamat, enraged, creates an army of monsters to avenge her consort. A younger god, Marduk, volunteers to fight Tiamat on the condition that he be granted supreme authority over all the gods. He defeats Tiamat, splits her body in half, and uses the pieces to create the heavens and the earth. After establishing cosmic order, Marduk turns his attention to a practical problem. The gods are still burdened with maintaining the universe. The solution, as in the Atrahasis, is to create a servant race. Marduk orders the execution of Kingu, Tiamat's second consort, and the leader of her monster army. From Kingu's blood, mixed with clay, humanity is formed. The text states, "Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage, man shall be his name. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." The language here is transactional. Humans are not created for companionship, spiritual evolution, or the glory of the gods. They are created to work. The term used for savage is lalu, which in Akkadian can mean primitive or mixed. Some scholars interpret this as referring to the hybrid nature of humanity, part divine, the blood of Kingu, and part earthly, the clay. Others see it as a description of humanity's role, a creature designed to interface between the divine and the material. The mixing of blood and clay appears in nearly every Mesopotamian creation account. It is not poetic flourish. It is repeated formula. The Atrahasis describes it in nearly identical terms. The Eridu Genesis, though fragmentary, uses the same imagery. Later Babylonian medical texts refer to the human body as clay of the gods, and anatomical descriptions sometimes mention the blood of the slain god as the source of human consciousness or intelligence. This suggests the metaphor, if it is a metaphor, was deeply embedded in how the Mesopotamians understood themselves. What makes the creation account unusual is the specificity of the materials. The Enuma Elish does not say Marduk spoke humanity into being. It says he used blood and clay. The Atrahasis adds even more detail. The blood of the slain god Wela is mixed with pure clay from the Abzu, the underground freshwater reservoir associated with Enki. The goddess Ninhursag, described as the Lady of Form, shapes the mixture into 14 portions, 7 male and 7 female. The portions are then quickened through a process the text does not fully describe, but which involves saliva, ritual words, and the goddess's breath. The result is 14 humans, the first of the species, created in a single batch. This assembly line imagery has led some researchers to compare the account to modern concepts of bioengineering. The blood provides genetic material, the clay provides structure, the goddess shapes and activates. Whether this was how the Sumerians literally understood it, or whether they were encoding a more abstract truth in biological language, is unclear. But the consistency of the description across multiple texts suggests it was central to their cosmology. In a tablet recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dated to the 7th century BCE, but copying older Sumerian material, another version of the creation appears. This one focuses on the role of Enki, who is described as the fashioner of forms. The text states that Enki opened the clay mold and breathed the breath of life into the first humans. The phrase clay mold is suggestive. It implies a container or form into which the material was placed, a method more aligned with craftsmanship than divine spontaneity. The tablet goes on to describe how the first humans were tested by the gods. They were placed in a garden, given tasks, and observed. Those who performed well were kept. Those who failed were discarded. The language is clinical. It describes quality control, selection, refinement. After several iterations, the text states, a good model was achieved, and this model was allowed to reproduce. From this point forward, humanity continued through natural birth, but the original creation was artificial, deliberate, and overseen by divine engineers. The garden mentioned in this text bears a striking resemblance to the Garden of Eden in the biblical Genesis. In the Sumerian version, the garden is called Dilmun, described as a place where the raven uttered no cry, the lion killed not, the wolf snatched not the lamb. It is a paradise, but also a testing ground. Enki creates it for the goddess Ninhursag, and it is there that the first humans are placed, given water and food, and instructed in basic tasks. Later, one of the humans, variously named Adapa or Adamu, disobeys a divine command and is cast out. The parallels to Adam and the fall are undeniable, though the Sumerian version is older by at least 1,000 years. What differentiates the Sumerian creation from the biblical one is the absence of sin. In Genesis, the fall is a moral failure. Humanity is punished for disobedience and pride. In the Sumerian version, the expulsion is procedural. The human fails a test, is deemed unfit for the divine garden, and is sent to live on earth. There is no talk of eternal punishment or inherited guilt. The event is treated as a sorting process. Those who pass remain close to the gods. Those who fail are sent to labor in the world. The concept of the breath of life also appears in both traditions. In Genesis, God breathes into Adam's nostrils, and he becomes a living soul. In the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, the goddess breathes into the clay forms, activating them. The image is identical, but the Sumerian texts add a detail the Bible omits. The breath is not just divine spirit, it is described as containing the essence of the god, a physical transfer of something from the creator to the created. Some tablets use the word napishtu, which can mean life, breath, or soul, but which in medical contexts refers to something measurable, something that can be present or absent. The number 14, 7 male, 7 female also recurs across multiple creation accounts. It appears to have symbolic significance, though the meaning is debated. 7 is a sacred number in Mesopotamian numerology, associated with completeness and divine order. The creation of 7 pairs suggests a balanced beginning, a stable population from which to expand. Later texts describe these original 14 as the seed of humanity, the ancestors from whom all people descend. Genetic studies have, intriguingly, identified population bottlenecks in human history moments when the total human population dropped to very small numbers, possibly as few as a few thousand individuals. One such bottleneck is estimated to have occurred around 70,000 years ago, following the eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia. Another, less well documented, may have occurred around 10,000 BCE, coinciding with the end of the last ice age. While these events occurred long before the rise of Sumer, they suggest that the idea of humanity descending from a small founding population is not purely mythological. It may reflect a deep, inherited memory of near extinction and rebirth. The creation tablets also describe a period of instruction, during which the Anunnaki teach the first humans essential skills. Enki is credited with giving humanity the knowledge of language, writing, agriculture, and law. These gifts are not presented as theft or rebellion. They are deliberate transfers of knowledge. In the Adapa myth, one of the oldest Sumerian tales, the human Adapa is brought before Anu, the sky god, and offered the bread of life and water of life, which would grant him immortality. Enki, however, warns Adapa not to accept the food, fearing it might be poisoned. Adapa obeys and loses the chance for eternal life. The story explains why humans are mortal, but it also reveals a tension among the gods. Some wish to elevate humanity, while others wish to keep them limited. This tension runs through much of Sumerian literature. The gods need humans to work, but they fear humans becoming too powerful. They give knowledge, but withhold immortality. They create a species in their image, but deny them full equality. The dynamic is complex, fraught with ambivalence, and utterly unlike the unconditional benevolence found in later monotheistic traditions. By the end of the Enuma Elish, humanity is established. The gods retire to their temples, satisfied that the burden of maintaining the world has been transferred. Marduk is hailed as king of the gods, and his city, Babylon, becomes the center of the cosmos. The creation is complete. But the text ends with a warning, inscribed by the scribes who copied it. Let the wise teach the wise, for the fool may not understand. The knowledge contained in the tablets, it seems, was not meant for everyone. It was meant for those who could grasp its deeper meaning, whether that meaning was theological, historical, or something else entirely. One of the most mysterious groups described in ancient Mesopotamian texts are beings called the Igigi. They are mentioned alongside the Anunnaki, but their role is distinct. While the Anunnaki are often depicted as lords and administrators, the Igigi are described as workers and laborers who carried out the physical tasks assigned by the higher gods. The clearest description of the Igigi comes from the Atrahasis, where they are identified as the gods who initially dug the rivers and irrigation channels. For 40 years, the text states, the Igigi toiled without rest, excavating the Tigris and Euphrates. The work was exhausting. Eventually, they revolted, throwing down their tools and refusing to continue. It is this rebellion that prompts the creation of humanity. The Igigi are freed from labor, and humans take their place. The word Igigi may derive from a root meaning to watch or to guard, leading to the translation, the Watchers. This has sparked comparisons to the biblical Watchers described in the quote, Book of Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic text written around the 3rd century BCE. In Enoch, the Watchers are angels who descend to earth, take human wives, and teach forbidden knowledge to humanity. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are described as giants who brought violence and corruption to the world, prompting God to send the flood. The parallels are striking. Both traditions describe heavenly beings descending to earth, interacting with humans, and ultimately being removed. Both link these beings to the time before the flood, and both suggest that their presence altered the course of human history in ways that required divine intervention to correct. In the Sumerian version, the Igigi are separated from humanity after the flood. Post-flood texts rarely mention them. One fragment, discovered at Nippur and dated to around 2000 BCE, describes a council where Enlil decrees that the Igigi must return to the heavens and no longer walk among men. The reason given is that their presence caused disorder and confusion of the bloodlines. The idea of divine human hybrids appears in Greek mythology, Hindu tradition, and nearly every ancient culture. But the Sumerian version treats these unions as a problem, one that required separation and a cataclysmic reset in the form of the flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero himself is described as 2/3 god, 1/3 man. His strength and wisdom set him apart, but he is still mortal. His quest to achieve eternal life fails. The story suggests that even partial divinity is not enough to escape death, a boundary the gods have set and will not allow to be crossed. The term Watchers appears in the Book of Enoch, where they are led by Azazel, who teaches humans metallurgy, cosmetics, and weaponry knowledge that was supposed to remain hidden. These are practical skills, not spiritual insights. The giving of this knowledge is treated as a transgression. In Sumerian texts, similar events are described with less moral judgment. Enki teaches humanity writing, law, and agriculture. These are gifts, not thefts, but they are also transfers of power. Each gift increases human autonomy, reducing dependence on the gods. After the flood, new rules were established. The Igigi are no longer mentioned. The Anunnaki become more distant, communicating through priests and omens rather than direct appearance. Kingship is re-established, but the kings are mortal. The age of direct divine presence is over. What remains unresolved is the question of who the Igigi were. Were they a lower caste of divine beings? Or were they something else, visitors who served a temporary role and then departed? The texts only record that the Igigi were here, that they worked, that they left, and that their absence marked a shift in the relationship between heaven and earth. One of the more controversial interpretations of the Sumerian texts comes from the claim that the Anunnaki came to Earth not to guide humanity, but to extract resources, specifically gold. This theory gained widespread attention through the work of Zecharia Sitchin, who argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a distant planet who needed gold to repair their atmosphere. According to Sitchin, they initially mined the gold themselves, but the work proved too difficult, leading them to genetically engineer humans as a labor force. While mainstream scholars reject this interpretation, the theory persists because elements of it can be found, however loosely, in the ancient texts. The idea begins with a passage in the Atrahasis, where the Igigi gods are described as laboring in the mines before their rebellion. The Akkadian term used is Ersetu, which can mean land, earth, or underworld, but in context seems to refer to excavation or digging. The text states that the Igigi carried the soil in baskets and dug the watercourses, but another fragment mentions that they brought up the shining stone from the depths. The identity of this shining stone is debated. Some scholars interpret it as lapis lazuli, a blue stone prized in Mesopotamia. Others suggest it could refer to copper, tin, or other metals. A small number of researchers, following Sitchin, argue it means gold. Gold held immense importance in Sumerian culture. It was used not only for jewelry and decoration, but also in religious contexts. Statues of gods were often gilded. Temple walls were inlaid with gold leaf. Offerings to the gods frequently included gold objects. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero commissions a golden statue of his friend Enkidu, and the gods themselves are described as having skin like gold, or faces of burnished gold. Whether this is literal or metaphorical is unclear, but gold is consistently associated with the divine. Archaeologically, evidence of ancient mining in the Near East is well documented. Copper mines in the Sinai Peninsula date back to at least 3000 BCE. Gold mines in Nubia, to the south of Egypt, were active even earlier. The Sumerians themselves did not have significant local sources of gold, which means they had to import it through long-distance trade networks. The effort required to acquire gold suggests it was highly valued, though whether for practical, symbolic, or religious reasons is not specified in the texts. Sitchin's claim that gold was needed to repair an alien atmosphere has no basis in the Sumerian Tablets. No text describes the Anunnaki using gold for atmospheric purposes, nor is there any mention of environmental damage or planetary engineering. The theory appears to be an extrapolation based on modern scientific concepts, applied retroactively to ancient myths. However, what the texts do describe is that the gods valued gold, that they required it in large quantities, and that they assigned humans to gather it. One tablet from the city of Lagash, dated to around 2400 BCE, contains an administrative record listing the output of a labor team assigned to bring the bright metal from the deep places. The record notes the number of workers, the amount extracted, and the destination, a temple dedicated to the goddess Ninhursag. Another reference appears in a hymn to the god Enki, found at Eridu. The text praises Enki as the one who opened the veins of the earth and brought forth the treasures hidden in stone. The language is geological. It describes extraction, discovery, access to resources that were previously unreachable. Interestingly, some Sumerian cylinder seals depict scenes of figures working in what appear to be mines or tunnels. One seal, currently in the Louvre, shows a row of workers carrying baskets on their heads, overseen by a larger figure holding a staff. The workers are depicted as smaller, hunched, and numerous, while the overseer is tall, upright, and distinct. Above the scene are symbols associated with the Anunnaki. The question of why the gods would need humans to mine for them has been addressed in various ways by different scholars. The traditional interpretation is that the mining is metaphorical. It represents the hard labor of agriculture, irrigation, and construction that built Sumerian civilization. The shining stone is not literal gold, but the wealth and prosperity that comes from organized human effort. This is a reasonable reading, consistent with the overall tone of Sumerian religion. But there are passages that resist purely symbolic interpretation. In one text, Enki is described as descending into the Abzu and bringing back stones of light that are placed in the foundations of temples. These stones are said to have special properties. They glow in darkness, they protect against evil spirits, and they enhance the power of rituals. Modern archaeology has found that the Sumerians did have advanced knowledge of metallurgy. They smelted copper and tin to create bronze. They refined silver and gold to high purity, techniques that required controlled heat and chemical processes. Some of this knowledge, according to the myths, was given by the gods. Enki is credited with teaching metalworking. These are not vague blessings, they are specific technical skills. The Sumerian texts do not answer why gold was so important. They simply state that the gods desired certain materials, that humans were created to provide them, and that this arrangement formed the basis of early civilization. Whether the materials were literal metals, agricultural surplus, or something more abstract, the structure remains the same. Humanity was made to serve, and in serving, to build the world as we know it. The mining colony theory, in its most literal form, is almost certainly wrong, but the questions it raises about labor, resources, and the origins of human industry are worth considering. The Sumerians did not mine gold for themselves alone. They mined it for the temples, for the gods, for reasons they considered essential to the cosmic order. Among the most unsettling aspects of the Sumerian creation accounts is the language used to describe how humans were made. The texts do not speak of divine breath alone or a spoken command. They describe a process, one involving materials, mixtures, and procedures, overseen by specific gods with specialized knowledge. To modern readers, especially those familiar with biological science, the descriptions can sound less like mythology and more like an ancient attempt to describe genetic engineering. The clearest example comes from the Atrahasis, where the goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu or Belet Ili, meaning Lady of the Gods, is tasked with creating humanity. The text describes her working in a creation chamber, or house of shaping, a location separate from the general assembly of the gods. She is assisted by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who provides the instructions. The process is detailed. First, the blood of a slain god, Wi'ila, is collected. This blood is described as containing intelligence or awareness, traits the gods wish to transfer to the new creation. The blood is then mixed with pure clay from the Abzu, Enki's underground domain. The mixture is kneaded, shaped, and divided into 14 portions. Ninhursag places each portion into a mold or form, then seals it. The text uses the word womb to describe these molds, suggesting an incubation process. After a period of time, the text says 10 months, the forms are opened, and the first humans emerge. What is striking is the procedural tone. The goddess does not create spontaneously. She follows instructions. She uses specific materials in specific quantities. She incubates, monitors, and finally delivers the finished creation. This is not magic, it is craft. And the result is not a single individual, but a batch, a set of identical or near identical beings, all produced at once. The language of mixing, purifying, and incubating has led some researchers to draw parallels to modern genetic engineering. In contemporary biology, creating a new organism involves combining genetic material from donors, cultivating it in controlled conditions, and waiting for it to develop. The ancient Sumerians had no knowledge of DNA, genes, or cellular biology, but they described in their own vocabulary a process that mirrors the steps of deliberate biological creation. The most controversial modern interpreter of these passages is Zecharia Sitchin, who argued that the Anunnaki used advanced genetic techniques to alter a pre-existing hominid species, creating Homo sapiens as a hybrid between their own biology and that of early humans. Mainstream scholars reject Sitchin's interpretation for several reasons. First, his translations of cuneiform are often criticized as inaccurate. Second, his astronomical claims are not supported by evidence. Third, his entire framework requires accepting that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings, a claim that has no basis in the texts themselves. Yet even without accepting Sitchin's conclusions, the language of the texts remains unusual. Why describe creation as a mixture of blood and clay? Why specify that the blood came from a god with intelligence? Why use the term pure to describe the clay, as if impure clay would yield a different result? In the Enuma Elish, the creation of humanity is similarly procedural. Marduk commands the execution of Kingu, and from his blood, Lulu, the primitive worker, is formed. The term Lulu has been debated. Some translate it as savage or beast man. Others note that it can mean mixed or crossbreed. In later Akkadian texts, Lulu is used to describe hybrid animals, mules for instance, which are the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Modern genetics has revealed that Homo sapiens did interbreed with other hominid species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Most humans today carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA. While this is not what the Sumerian texts describe, it does establish that the concept of human ancestry involving more than one lineage is scientifically accurate. Another intriguing detail is the emphasis on the goddess Ninhursag as the one who shapes the forms. In Sumerian culture, Ninhursag was associated with fertility, childbirth, and the creation of life. In medical texts, she is invoked in prayers for safe childbirth. Her role in the creation myths is consistent with this function. She is not just a creatrix, but a specialist in biological processes. One tablet describes a series of experiments where Ninhursag creates various plants and animals by mixing different materials and incubating them in her body. Some of the creations are successful. Others are deformed or fail to live. The story reads as a description of iterative experimentation, testing combinations, observing results, refining methods. If the Sumerians were describing a genetic experiment, they would not have had the vocabulary to do so directly. They would have had to use the language available to them, words from agriculture, animal husbandry, pottery. Mixing clay and blood is how one might describe combining substances without words for genetics. Incubating in a womb is how one might describe a controlled growth environment. Purifying materials is how one might describe selecting for specific traits. One passage in the Atrahasis describes how the first humans were imperfect. Some were sterile, others were weak. Ninhursag and Enki returned to the creation chamber multiple times, refining the design until a stable, reproducible model was achieved. Only then was humanity allowed to multiply. This iterative process is strikingly similar to selective breeding, or how modern genetic engineering proceeds through trial, error, and optimization. Whether the creation was literal or symbolic, The Sumerians preserved a memory of humanity's origins as something intentional, designed, and controlled. They did not see themselves as accidents of evolution or spontaneous products of nature. They saw themselves as the result of a deliberate act carried out by beings with knowledge, skill, and purpose. And they wrote it down in the oldest script on the oldest tablets so that it would not be forgotten. The flood appears in Sumerian literature not as divine punishment for sin, but as a response to overpopulation. In the Atrahasis, the gods grow disturbed by the noise of humanity. The text states, "The land bellowed like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamor and said to the great gods, 'The noise of mankind has become too much. I lose sleep because of their racket.' The solution Enlil proposes is extermination. The other gods agree, with one exception. Enki, who has grown fond of humanity and decides to intervene. Enki visits a man named Atrahasis, described as exceedingly wise, and warns him of the coming deluge. He instructs Atrahasis to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, and to bring aboard his family and representatives of all living creatures. The dimensions of the boat are given in cubits, the materials are specified, and the construction timeline is laid out. This is not a vision or a miracle, it is an engineering project. Atrahasis follows the instructions, completes the vessel, and boards it just as the rains begin. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The text describes water rising from below and falling from above, covering the mountains, drowning the earth. When it ends, Atrahasis releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven does not return, indicating that dry land has appeared. Atrahasis disembarks, offers a sacrifice, and the gods, smelling the offering, gather around. Enlil is initially furious that a human has survived, but Enki argues that humanity should be preserved, though in a reduced and regulated state. A new covenant is established. Humans will be allowed to continue, but their numbers will be controlled through death, disease, and barrenness. This story, told in Sumer around 2000 BCE, predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. The parallels are exact. The warning, the boat, the animals, the flood, the birds, the sacrifice, the covenant. Genesis borrowed the structure wholesale, adding only a moral dimension. Noah is saved because he is righteous, not merely wise. In the Sumerian version, there is no sin. The flood is not punishment, it is population control. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes the flood story as told by Utnapishtim, a man who survived the deluge and was granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh seeks him out, hoping to learn the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim recounts the flood in vivid detail, describing how the storm was so violent that even the gods were terrified. He describes how he sealed the boat, how the waters rose, how the world was drowned, and how, when it ended, he was the only human left alive. The gods, Utnapishtim says, wept at what they had done. They had not intended to destroy everything, only to reduce the noise, but the flood exceeded their control. The goddess Ishtar is described as lamenting, "The days of old have turned to clay, because I commanded evil in the assembly of the gods." The regret is profound. The gods realize they have made a mistake, and they vow never to repeat it. The question of whether the flood was a historical event has been debated for over a century. Geologists have found evidence of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, corresponding to sediment layers that indicate sudden, deep inundation. The city of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920 seconds, revealed an 8-foot layer of clean clay separating 2 distinct periods of occupation. Woolley declared, "This is the flood of Genesis." While most scholars now believe the deposit represents a localized river flood rather than a global deluge, it does confirm that massive flooding occurred in the region, but the Sumerian flood is not described as local. The texts state that the entire world was covered, that all life perished except those on the boat. If this was a real event, it must have been regional but perceived as total by those who experienced it. In a flat, low-lying river valley like southern Mesopotamia, a massive flood could easily seem apocalyptic, drowning every settlement and leaving only water as far as the eye could see. The timing also aligns with a known environmental shift. Around 3000 BCE, the Persian Gulf experienced rising sea levels due to glacial melt. Coastal settlements would have been inundated, forcing populations inland. Some researchers have suggested that the memory of this gradual submersion was later compressed into the narrative of a sudden divine flood. What is undeniable is that the flood story was central to Sumerian identity. It divided history into two eras, before and after. It explained why the kings of old lived for millennia, while later kings lived for decades. It justified the establishment of new laws and new relationships between gods and humans. The flood was not incidental, it was foundational. Over 200 cultures around the world have flood myths, many with strikingly similar details. The Greeks told of Deucalion, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before the world is drowned. The Chinese have Gunyu, who controlled the Great Flood. Indigenous peoples from the Hopi to the Mapuche speak of great waters that covered the land. Some scholars attribute this global distribution to the fact that every culture experiences flooding, but the consistency is remarkable. The warning, the boat, the animals, the dove or bird, the sacrifice, these elements repeat too precisely to be entirely independent. In the Sumerian version, the flood is followed by a covenant. The gods agree to limit humanity's growth through natural means, death, infertility, illness, rather than wholesale destruction. The text states, "Let there be a third category among the people, women who bear and women who do not bear." This is interpreted as the introduction of biological limits on reproduction. The gods also create demons and diseases to periodically reduce numbers without requiring another flood. This post-flood covenant is echoed in Genesis, where God promises Noah, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, nor will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." A rainbow is given as a sign of this promise. In the Sumerian version, there is no rainbow, but the covenant is just as binding. The flood, whether historical or mythological, serves a narrative function. It resets the world. It erases the antediluvian age, the time of the long-lived kings, the rebellious Igigi, the mingling of divine and human. After the flood, the world is smaller, more regulated, more clearly divided. The gods retreat, humans multiply, but within limits. The age of direct divine intervention is over, replaced by a system of mediated contact through priests and temples. The memory of the flood was preserved not just in myth, but in practice. Sumerian cities built walls against the rivers. They developed irrigation systems designed to prevent flooding. The fear of another flood shaped their architecture, their agriculture, and their religion. The past, whether real or imagined, dictated the structure of the present. In this way, the flood story is both history and instruction. It tells the Sumerians who they are, why they suffer, and how they must live. It explains death, disease, and hardship as necessary checks on human excess. And it preserves a memory possibly real, possibly symbolic of a time when the world ended and then began again. After the flood, the relationship between the gods and humanity changed. The direct, almost casual interactions described in pre-flood texts give way to a more formalized system. The gods no longer walk among humans. They communicate through priests, omens, and dreams. Knowledge, once freely given by Enki and others, becomes restricted, guarded, and parceled out in controlled amounts. This shift is described in several texts as deliberate, a decision made by the gods to prevent humanity from growing too powerful or too independent. One of the most explicit accounts appears in a fragment known as the Adapa myth, discovered among the tablets at Amarna in Egypt, but originating from Mesopotamian sources. Adapa is described as the first man created by Enki, endowed with wisdom but denied immortality. One day, while fishing, Adapa is capsized by the south wind. In anger, he breaks the wind's wing, calming the storms but also disrupting the cosmic order. Anu, the sky god, summons Adapa to heaven to answer for this transgression. Before Adapa departs, Enki warns him that he will be offered the bread of death and the water of death, and that he must refuse them. Adapa obeys. But when he arrives, Anu, impressed by Adapa's wisdom, offers him not death, but the bread of life and the water of life, which would grant immortality. Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refuses. Only afterward does he learn that he has rejected eternal life. The opportunity is lost forever. The story has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some see it as a myth explaining why humans must die. Others read it as a parable about the dangers of blind obedience. But there is a third interpretation, that Enki intentionally withheld immortality from humanity, fearing what would happen if humans became equal to the gods. What is clear is that after the flood, the gods became more cautious about what they shared. The me, those divine principles or decrees that govern civilization, were no longer distributed freely. Instead, they were kept in Enki's temple in Eridu, under guard. Only priests with proper authorization could access them. This theme appears in the story of Inanna, stealing the me from Enki. According to the myth, Inanna visits Enki's temple and plies him with beer until he becomes intoxicated. In his drunkenness, he gives her over 100 me. Inanna loads the me onto her boat and flees to her own city, Uruk. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he has done and sends monsters to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes. The story is often read as a myth about the transfer of cultural authority, but it also reflects an anxiety about knowledge being too widely distributed. The me are not infinite, they are finite, transferable objects. Whoever possesses them wields their power. The biblical story of the Tree of Knowledge echoes this structure. In Genesis, God forbids Adam and Eve from eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The serpent tempts them, saying, "You will be like God." They eat, gain knowledge, and are immediately expelled from the garden. The punishment is mortality. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life, God says, and so humanity is barred from eternal life. The parallels to the Adapa myth are clear. In both stories, knowledge and immortality are kept separate. Humans may have one, but not both. The gods fear that if humanity possesses both wisdom and eternal life, they will become equals or rivals. This severance is described in several post-flood Sumerian texts as a necessary boundary. One fragment states, "Wisdom was given to man, but the secret of the gods was withheld." The implication is that there is knowledge humans are meant to have, and knowledge they are not. In later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, this restriction becomes even more explicit. The practice of divination and astrology was restricted to trained priests. Unauthorized divination was punishable by death. The rationale was that certain knowledge was too powerful to be handled by the uninitiated. The same concern appears in the Book of Enoch, where the Watchers are condemned not for descending to earth, but for teaching forbidden knowledge. Azazel teaches men to make weapons. Others teach astrology and herbalism. These are practical skills, but they are presented as violations of divine order. The Sumerians, however, did not romanticize this control. They accepted it as part of the cosmic structure. Humans were created to serve, and the knowledge they received was enough to perform their function, but not enough to transcend it. Yet there are hints that some humans resisted this limitation. The figure of Gilgamesh seeks immortality, travels to the edges of the world, and confronts the gods directly. He fails, but his quest itself is an act of defiance, a refusal to accept the boundaries imposed on humanity. The severing of knowledge after the flood was not absolute. Over time, humans learned more, built more, and understood more. But they did so slowly, through effort and trial. The age of direct instruction was over. The gods no longer taught. Instead, humans had to discover, invent, and record on their own. Writing became essential because it allowed knowledge to persist beyond a single generation. In this way, the Sumerian tablets themselves become an act of resistance. By writing down their history, their laws, and their myths, the Sumerians preserved what might otherwise have been lost. They created a permanent record, one that even the gods could not erase. The rediscovery of cuneiform in the 19th century was one of the most significant archaeological achievements in history. For over 2,000 years, the script had been unreadable. The tablets lay buried until European explorers began unearthing them. The first breakthrough came in 1835, when Henry Rawlinson began copying the Behistun inscription, a trilingual text carved by Persian king Darius I. Rawlinson deciphered the Old Persian first, then used that knowledge to unlock Akkadian. By the 1850 seconds, scholars could read Babylonian and Assyrian tablets. Sumerian remained a mystery for decades longer. The solution came through painstaking comparison. Sumerian words appeared in Akkadian tablets with explanations. By cross-referencing hundreds of bilingual texts, linguists slowly reconstructed Sumerian grammar. By 1900, the basic structure was understood. By 1930, entire epics had been translated. The first major publication came from Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades translating tablets. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced the public to the oldest literature on Earth. Kramer's translation showed the Sumerians had invented not only writing but also the first schools, legal codes, and recorded proverbs. Kramer was careful in his translations. He noted ambiguities and gaps. But even his conservative interpretations revealed a worldview far more complex than previously imagined. The Sumerian gods were active, involved, and procedural. The relationship between divine and human was contractual, not worshipful. In the 1970 seconds, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, arguing that the Sumerian texts were historical records of extraterrestrial contact. Sitchin claimed the word Anunnaki meant those who from heaven came down, and that references to celestial boats describe spacecraft. Academic scholars rejected Sitchin's interpretations. His translations were criticized as selective and inaccurate. Sumerian grammar is complex, and many words have multiple meanings. Sitchin consistently chose the most sensational translation, ignoring more plausible alternatives. His claim about a planet called Nibiru was based on a misreading of astronomical texts that actually referred to Jupiter. Yet Sitchin's work gained a massive following. His book sold millions of copies. The appeal was clear. He offered a literal reading of texts that mainstream scholars dismissed as myth. He treated the Sumerians as reliable witnesses. The problem with Sitchin's work is not that he took the text seriously, it's that he misunderstood the language. A single cuneiform sign can represent a syllable, a word, or a concept. When a text says the Anunnaki came from An, does it mean from the god Anu, from the sky, or from a heavenly realm? All three are grammatically possible. Professional translators navigate these ambiguities by relying on context, parallel texts, and linguistic patterns. Sitchin often chose meanings that fit his narrative, even when other interpretations were more likely. Despite academic rejection, Sitchin's influence persists. Researchers like Eric von Daniken and Graham Hancock have built on his foundation, arguing that ancient texts describe advanced beings who visited Earth in prehistory. Mainstream scholars counter that these texts are myths. Myths serve psychological, social, and spiritual functions. To read them as literal accounts is to misunderstand their purpose. This is the standard academic interpretation. But the Sumerian texts resist easy categorization. They are too detailed, too procedural, too consistent. Consider the Sumerian king list. If it were purely mythological, why include precise reign lengths? Why list cities, succession, and total years? Why would later historical kings be listed in the same format as pre-flood kings? Or consider the flood story. The dimensions of the boat, the materials used, the number of days, all are specific and repeated across sources. If this were merely symbolic, why include engineering details? The truth is probably somewhere between extremes. The Sumerians did record myths, but they also recorded what they believed to be history. A king could be both historical and mythological. A flood could be both real and divine. The gods could be both cosmic forces and specific entities. Modern translators continue working through thousands of tablets that remain untranslated. new discoveries are still being made. Each new text refines our understanding and sometimes introduces new mysteries. The Sumerian tablets are not a single coherent narrative. They are a library, thousands of voices spanning centuries. To read them is to enter a world that is familiar and alien. The Sumerians worried about taxes, honored their dead, and sought meaning in the stars. But they also believed they had been created by beings from the sky, that those beings had taught them everything, and that their purpose was to serve a cosmic order. Whether that belief was based on reality, misunderstood phenomena, inherited memory, or imagination, the tablets do not say. They only preserve the claim, written in the oldest script, in the oldest cities, by people who had no reason to lie, and they wait in museums and archives for translators who will continue deciphering, interpreting, and arguing over what it all means. At the heart of the Sumerian tablets lies a question that has never been fully answered. Were the stories they tell meant as history or as myth? The distinction seems clear to modern readers. History is what happened. Myth is what people believed or imagined. But for the Sumerians, that line may not have existed. They recorded both in the same script, on the same tablets, using the same tone and structure. A king list that names historical rulers also names kings who ruled for 28,000 years. A creation story that describes divine beings mixing blood and clay is copied and preserved with the same care as a legal contract. To the scribes, it all mattered. It all needed to be remembered. This ambiguity has made the Sumerian texts endlessly debatable. Scholars interpret them as mythology, poetic attempts to explain the origins of the world, the development of civilization, and the nature of divine authority. The gods are symbols. The numbers are exaggerations. The creation accounts are allegories for natural processes like reproduction, agriculture, or social organization. This is a reasonable interpretation, supported by linguistic analysis, comparative mythology, and the study of how oral traditions evolve over time. But there is another reading, one that takes the texts at face value. What if the Sumerians wrote what they believed to be true? What if the Anunnaki were not symbols, but beings they encountered or inherited memories of? What if the creation of humanity was not a metaphor, but an event their ancestors witnessed or participated in? What if the long-lived kings, the flood, the severed knowledge, and the departure of the gods were all real, recorded in the only language available, and passed down as essential history? This interpretation is harder to accept, because it requires rethinking what we know about the past. It suggests that before recorded history, there was something else, another age, another kind of world, perhaps even another kind of humanity. It suggests that the rise of civilization was not a slow, gradual process, but a sudden leap, catalyzed by knowledge that came from somewhere outside the normal course of human development. There is some archaeological support for this idea, though it is controversial. The earliest cities in Sumer Eridu, Uruk, Ur appear suddenly around 4000 BCE, fully formed with irrigation systems, monumental architecture, and sophisticated social organization. There is little evidence of a slow buildup. Villages existed before, but the transition from village to city was rapid, almost abrupt. Writing, metallurgy, mathematics, and law all emerge in the same narrow window of time. Some researchers have called this the Sumerian explosion, comparing it to the Cambrian explosion in biology, when complex life forms appeared suddenly in the fossil record. Where did the knowledge come from? The Sumerians themselves said it came from the gods. Enki taught writing. Ninhursag shaped the first humans. The Anunnaki gave the Me, the principles of civilization. Whether these gods were literal beings, cultural heroes who were later deified, or symbolic representations of collective human achievement, the result is the same. Knowledge appeared, was recorded, and became the foundation of everything that followed. The flood divides this history into before and after. Before the flood, the world was different. Kings lived longer. Gods walked among men, and the boundaries between the divine and the human were more permeable. After the flood, those boundaries hardened. The gods withdrew. Humanity was left to manage itself, guided by laws and traditions, but no longer directly supervised. This is the structure the Sumerians recorded, and it is echoed in the Bible, in Greek mythology, in Hindu cosmology, and in the oral traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide. Modern science offers no explanation for why so many cultures remember a flood, a golden age, and a subsequent decline. Evolutionary psychology suggests that humans are predisposed to imagine lost paradises and fallen states because it helps us make sense of suffering and mortality. Anthropology argues that flood myths arise naturally in societies living near rivers, lakes, or oceans, where flooding is a common threat. These are plausible explanations, but they do not account for the specificity of the Sumerian version, or for why it was written down, preserved, and treated as foundational truth for millennia. There is also the matter of the tablets themselves. They were not ephemeral. They were baked, stored, and archived in libraries. The Sumerians developed a scribal class specifically to maintain these records. They built institutions around the preservation of knowledge. When Babylon conquered Sumer, they copied the tablets. When Assyria conquered Babylon, they copied them again. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh contained thousands of cuneiform tablets, many of them duplicates of older Sumerian originals. The texts were considered important enough to protect, copy, and carry forward through every political upheaval and cultural shift. If they were only myths, why the effort? Why not let them fade, as so many oral traditions do? The answer may be that the Sumerians believed the tablets contained essential information about who they were, where they came from, and how to maintain the order of the world. Losing that knowledge was unthinkable, so they wrote it in clay, which does not decay, and they fired it in kilns, which makes it nearly indestructible. They created a permanent record, one that could outlast empires, languages, and even memory itself. And they succeeded. The tablets survived. They were buried under the ruins of dead cities, but they endured. When archaeologists unearthed them, they found not just stories, but a worldview, a complete cosmology, preserved in the oldest writing system ever invented. To read the tablets is to hear the voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago, speaking across the centuries, asking to be understood. The question remains, what were they trying to say? Were they recording myths to explain their world, or were they recording history to preserve a truth they feared would be forgotten? Were the Anunnaki gods, or something else? Was the creation of humanity a metaphor, or a memory? Was the flood a natural disaster, or a deliberate reset? The tablets do not answer these questions directly. They only present the claim over and over in text after text, city after city, century after century. We were made by beings from the sky, for a purpose we still serve. Perhaps the truth is less important than the fact that the question endures. For thousands of years, humans have wondered where they came from, why they exist, and what lies beyond the boundaries of the known. The Sumerians asked the same questions. They wrote down the answers they found, whether those answers came from observation, revelation, or imagination. And those answers, preserved in cuneiform on clay, have shaped every civilization that followed. The Bible borrowed from them. The Greeks built on them. The Romans inherited them. The medieval scholars translated them. The Enlightenment thinkers dismissed them. The modern world rediscovered them. And now, in the 21st century, as we unlock the human genome, search for life on other planets, and contemplate our own origins with tools the Sumerians could never have imagined, we find ourselves asking the same question they asked: are we alone, or did someone make us? The Sumerian tablets do not prove that humanity was created by extraterrestrial beings. They do not prove that the Anunnaki were real, or that the flood was a global event, or that ancient kings lived for tens of thousands of years. But they do prove that the oldest civilization on Earth believed these things were true, and they wrote them down in the oldest script, on the most durable medium, so that we, their distant descendants, would one day read them and wonder. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the question itself is the legacy, not the answer, but the act of asking. The Sumerians looked at the world, saw complexity and order, and concluded that someone must have designed it. They recorded that conclusion in clay. And now, 5,000 years later, we hold those tablets, decipher those signs, and ask ourselves, were they wrong, or did they know something we have forgotten? The question remains open. The tablets remain silent, waiting for the next generation of translators, archaeologists, and thinkers to read them again, with fresh eyes and new tools. And somewhere, buried under the sands of Iraq, or archived in a museum basement, there may be more tablets, more stories, more evidence waiting to be unearthed. The Sumerians wrote in clay, and clay endures. So does the question. And perhaps in the end, that is what they intended, not to give us the answer, but to make sure we never stopped asking.